Okay.
All right, so I think I just want to kind of gauge, where you kind of stand on this. So, um, you personally, what do you think is the greatest challenge the Hawaii economy faces, and why do you think it's the greatest challenge compared to others that people may say is the challenge that we should pay attention to?
Well, our biggest challenge is getting the basics correct. And so basics are things like traffic. If you can't get around the city in a reasonable way, you're going to find that talented people are going to say, I'm going to be more productive elsewhere. Or they're going to limit their activities. I mean, traffic is a really big deal. Housing is another big deal here. If you look at why it is that Hawaii is such an expensive place, we're just not that much more expensive on a whole range of goods. Okay, we're only about 10% more expensive than your average US city, except for housing. Okay, and then when you add in housing, it takes up a big part of people's incomes. We're 70 to 80% more expensive. And so, anybody really has to get the housing. I mean, if we're to succeed in improving our situation, we need to figure out better ways to house people. And that basically means building more housing and figuring out how we're comfortable building the more housing. And the third area, and I call these the basics, is public education. If we don't have a good public education system, it harms us in the economy of the 21st century. The economy of the 21st century is essentially based upon people having solid educations where they know something in the sciences, they know something in statistics, mathematics. They're able to apply a whole variety of high-tech tools to their particular fields, whether we're talking about art, history, English, museum science. There's a whole variety of areas that are very humanistic in many ways, and yet in today's economy, you need to be able to apply more tools to them. And so it's just really imperative for the islands that we continue to reform our public school system and look at how it's performing and figure out better ways for it to perform. If those three things are done, a lot of the concerns of people about diversification will take care of themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It will also enable, I think it's just really, the most important thing a society can do is to make sure that the next generation has appropriate tools for it to succeed. And the tools really are education, making sure people are able to find reasonably priced housing here, and that we also find that it's possible to actually get around the islands. I live in Oahu because that's where I live, but you get around all the islands. It's the same concerns over in Maui. If you ask people what are our concerns, they are those three: education, housing, and traffic. There's other things. There's other things we could talk about, really other things that are important. But I think if legislators start to get away from that, they start to believe that getting an organic food tax credit correct. Those things in some ways are kind of manini. Okay.
Yeah, I do recall that a statistic that there are more automobiles registered on Maui than there are people. So I think that also contributes to the congestion. This wasn't something that I discussed with you earlier, but because you mentioned education, I think it'd be important to see where you are on this. Do you think that the public education system here, and as you mentioned, like housing and traffic, do you think all of that helps to contribute to what people call the Hawaii's brain drain? How all of these people from Hawaii, as you mentioned, are choosing to leave in search of better paying jobs, lower costs of living, better opportunities?
It's really important to remember that we're a small island. We're never going to have a highly diversified economy. Every single major metro area in the United States that's successful, that has high incomes. Okay, you don't really want to look at the low income ones, but ones that have high incomes, they have some specialization. They don't just have a little bit of everything. And that specialization essentially allows deep labor pools in that area. It enables some R&D to go on in that particular area. And there's potential too, if things aren't working out with one firm, you move on to another firm. When you have really, really small industries, a whole bunch of really small industries, you don't have deep labor pools for that industry. If things aren't working out with your current firm, it's hard to move to other ones because there aren't many. Things can be very insular. And so we have to specialize a bit. Because we specialize a bit, it means that people here who grow up and have talents in those other areas are naturally going to move. This idea that everybody's going to stay here, Yeah, I mean, what we find is if you want to stay here, oftentimes you need to make some sacrifices. You need to do a job that's not really in that area where you have the most expertise. For people who are very professionally oriented, for someone who's an actor, the opportunities in the mainland are so much higher than they are here. That's not to say too that we shouldn't worry about having good opportunities in the arts for people here who are skilled in the arts. We have incredible talents in the arts. We ought to be enabling better opportunities for those artists to stay here. But then if we take a look, we just step back and say, are most artists going to leave? Of course, there's better opportunities elsewhere, period. And so this idea that we're going to try to keep everybody here that's talented is a pipe dream. And it's really annoying to hear people talk about that as that's what we should be doing. What we need to be doing, though, is giving people more opportunities. I look at things like the new film school out at University of Hawaii West Oahu that Chris Lee is heading up. I mean, Chris always says he wants a measure of success is whether people stay here. But that's true. A measure of success is that we build up a local film industry and more people with talent stay here. But many of the most talented people may still decide to leave because there's better opportunities elsewhere. We just need to recognize that too, and not act as if it's a failure when someone who's a great actor ends up starring on Broadway.
No, yeah, I think something that you mentioned was we keep going back to this idea of policymakers, right? And I think something I noticed that when I was reading your articles on the carbon tax, on agriculture, and just on all of these recommendations that you make in general, is that what you recommend and what other economists at UH and local economists suggest the state should do is not, or not even at all, in line with what the legislature is doing. So do you think, I think in nowadays it's a very it's a pretty big issue, I think, that we've seen, that people don't necessarily trust the experts. And I think their economists and politicians actually rank, I think, equally for like the least trusted.
That low level. I think part of that is that everybody needs to make a better effort to communicate. And I think economists oftentimes write up their positions, their articles, arguments about issues using lots of jargon. We need when possible to also write up the same arguments where we get away from the jargon and we make the arguments that an average reader reading the article could say, yes, I understand what you're getting at. I mean, the stuff that I've written on agriculture, we have tried to emphasize that there's room for improvement in the agricultural sector here. What we're doing right now, there's all sorts of missteps and problems. I don't think we have a well-functioning Hawaii State Department of Agriculture. We haven't really thought through some of the synergies and some of the future crops where we may be able to have success. But for anybody who believes that we're going to have a large percentage of GDP generated from agriculture over the next 30 years, I think all you have to do is go back and look at the numbers, and it's just not feasible. This is one of these cases where economists just sometimes have to give bad news too, and people don't like any bad news like that. Even if we double agricultural production, which is feasible here, it's certainly feasible to double agricultural production. We could be producing a lot more fruits and veggies from our everyday life, but is that really going to enhance our overall income very much? No. And then one of the things we point out in the article is most of the people working in agriculture are not making good incomes. Telling people go into an agricultural sector where people are earning low incomes, barely getting by, where most of the farms are losing money. Hey, that's your road to future success. Before we do that, we need to make sure that we figure out ways to get the agricultural sector in better shape. And that comes from the sector itself too. The sector also needs to make sure that farmers are organizing and figuring out ways to improve their situation among themselves. I mean, that's a common way that industries tend to improve, but the state could play a bigger role here. I just don't think the services being provided to farmers are up to date. We still have hangovers from the days when we were mostly in pineapple and sugar. And so a lot of our specialists were in that area. They've tried to move over to other areas. We're having problems providing services to the new farmers that are out there. We also don't like to evaluate our programs. We don't like to say, we started up this program, it's an experiment and it hasn't worked, let's try something else. Instead we tend to get kind of, I suggested that program, so that program must be good. We don't like to say, hey, we thought it would be good and it didn't work. Politicians particularly don't like saying that. They just like to say, let's throw more money at it or let's reform it. But sometimes we just have to say, let's try something different. In the area of agriculture, it's really something we have to think about. when we talk about, say, increasing the production of fruits, well, we can do that, but the local market is very limited. If we're really going to increase production of fruits, we need to be looking at exports. Exports are limited just because of, say, things like the fruit fly. And we've tried for decades to figure out ways to rid fruits of the fruit fly before they're exported. And we're finding it's a very problematic venture, very problematic to eradicate the fruit fly. Mainland markets don't want to get produce with the fruit fly. With papayas, we tried irradiating the papayas. That's not radiation, but just these didn't work all that well. And so, it's when people just say, "Oh, let's just increase the supply of fruit," the local population isn't going to do it. We need to be figuring out export markets too. These aren't simple questions. And in that article I wrote in agriculture, I don't pretend that I have the answers, but we ought to be. I mean, the state ought to be engaging more people, both in the private sector, the academic sector, and in state government to try to find some of these answers. That on that front, I'm very optimistic about the future role of government and what it's possible for us to do. Whether we'll get there is a whole nother story.
So I think getting to these changes, a question that I'd like your perspective on is, like, where do you think this resistance to change comes from? I think some people, I think the thing I've been hearing from a lot of people is that it's largely a cultural thing. It's just something that in Hawaii, we're very resistant to change, and we're too fixated on what we had before, like the good times, the good old days.
In some sense, change is always difficult. For individuals, it's difficult too. Somebody has a problem with alcohol. Change doesn't come easy. I mean, it can take time for people to recognize the problem and then to figure out what's a feasible way of getting it fixed. If we're looking at state government, one of the things we find is that change tends to come about when all parties are consulted with. And, this is a multi-ethnic state. We find that there are all sorts of different types of people here. And the one thing that I find when I talk to people from of different cultures, ethnic groups, incomes, education, is everybody wants to be consulted. And I think in a society like this, we have to go the extra step and make sure that people are consulted. But that takes time, it takes more effort, and it means a slower process. It is much easier, although not that much easier, in a society where people are relatively homogeneous. Okay, so if people are relatively homogeneous,
no, definitely,
you don't see the divisions. It's easier to consult with just it's easier to consult with a few organizations to get an idea of where the society stands. With us, you have to consult with these organizations. You need to make some changes in what you're doing too to try to meet people's concerns. It's hard to pull off. Extensive change, and then change produces winners and losers. This idea, I mean, there's times where you can have win-win change, okay, where everybody can ultimately benefit. There's other times, no. What we're going to find is that most people are going to gain, but there's some others who are going to lose on out. And there needs to be mechanisms found to try to compensate those people, or we just have to recognize that we have to move on as a society. That sometimes we end up with some groups being left behind. We need to be careful on who those groups are, and how we're doing these processes. So I think in Hawaii it takes a lot of consultation. I should remind you too, though, that when Hawaii first became a state, we had all these institutions in place. When I talk about institutions, I mean that broadly. We had all these institutions in place that were meant essentially to serve the groups that were the colonial groups, the groups that benefited from Hawaii being a colony. And when people got the vote here, because before you had the vote, but it didn't really mean all that much. Now all of a sudden you had the vote and you were electing a governor. The governor was appointing Hawaii Supreme Court justices and other judges. People are directly electing the legislature, and the legislature now has power. It can't be overruled by the president in DC or by the U.S. Congress. Okay, so all of a sudden people have the vote, and they basically tell their representatives, "Hey, we want some changes. Okay, we want a better public education system. We want a University of Hawaii that actually works. That our kids can go there and get a world-class education." And the legislature responded. They did those things. People said, "We're really concerned about healthcare. We'd like to have some type of healthcare system," and a pioneering healthcare system was put in place. All these changes came about in the 60s and 70s. We also did a lot to dismantle vested corporate interests that really a hangover from the colonial era. Can we do that today? Of course we can make these big changes, but they require a lot of prep work, a lot of consultation. I haven't seen us doing that. I think part of it is we're not doing the prep work. We're not really bringing people together and figuring out what can we do to solve these issues. I don't want to spend a lot of time on Hawaiian issues, but I think Native Hawaiians have a lot of legitimate grievances that really need to be addressed. We ought to be thinking about addressing them and having a constitutional convention at some point in time. Are we ready for that today? No, because we haven't done the prep work. I mean, to do the prep work requires Hawaiians to get together and to think a little bit more about what they want. We did see some of this happening with the Constitutional Convention for a potential Hawaiian sovereign state that was held a few years back, but that work has kind of stalled. And it's really incumbent for Hawaiians, but then it's incumbent for the rest of the community to respond, for us to have some type of private public institutions that are trying to gauge people's opinions and then trying to come up with some alternatives. These plans and stuff don't just come out of the blue. And when they do come out of the blue, they're often not well suited for the society. So, but is Hawaii capable of making big changes? Of course, we are. I mean, are we ready for that right now? No, there's some prep work necessary. And that's why when people say, oh, we need to diversify the economy tomorrow, flip these switches and let's get less tourism and let's get these high income industries out there. These things just don't happen overnight. I mean, and it's a pipe dream to really think they are going to happen overnight. With tourism, though, we clearly face all sorts of problems with tourism, and we need to be addressing them. We've let some of these problems mount up, and some of the problems are relatively new. We've had massive growth in tourism numbers over the last 5 years, and yet, if you look at tourism spending hasn't increased all that much. I mean, one can arguably say that tourism spending is just a little bit more than it was back in 1990. That what we've done is we've replaced what used to be relatively high spending tourists with a lot more tourists who spend less. This idea, though, that all of a sudden a group of us are going to meet, we're going to say, okay, how do we replace these people in their 20s from the West Coast who are coming here to have fun, to hike the trails, to rent cars, clog the roads, eat, maybe buy food at Costco and stay at a cheap Airbnb. Well, first of all, we need some of those people to make this an exciting place. You don't just want to have older high spending people, but this idea we can just flip a switch and all of a sudden we're going to get all these high spending people here. Every other tourism area on earth would like to do that. They have a few less tourists and have people who spend a lot more, who are throwing dollars out of the place. So we need to go back and ask in tourism, what is it that it's feasible to do? There's a lot of stuff with tourism where I think we've just plain have acted too slowly. I mean, things like not having people trample popular tourist destinations. The pictures that you see of people climbing to the top of Diamond Head, the wall-to-wall people going on up, us not charging anything of any significance to people to do what is a very valuable experience. We need to stop this and essentially ask ourselves, how are we going to protect really valuable natural resources? I've suggested too, along with Justin Tyndall, an assistant professor in the economics department and a UHERO researcher, we've suggested that, hey, really crowded highways, like the highway to Hana, we should be thinking about doing a toll for visitors. If visitors want to do that, we should charge them a toll. Another option would be to explicitly limit the number of cars that has the ability to actually go on that road every day. Not so much the people who live there, but people who are out there for tourists. That road only has so much capacity. Those parking lots where people are stopping and cars are being parked a mile up the road and down the road on very narrow roads, creating hazards. That's just not something that we should be dealing with as a society. We need to figure out ways to deal with these problems. So the Hana Highway, we could easily ask that all rental cars have a transponder be put on them. When you enter the highway, you're charged a toll, say $100 to travel the highway. That will immediately reduce the number of tourists who decide that they're going to visit, that they're going to go down the Hana Highway. Now, where do those people go? Again, there needs to be more thought and planning being given to this, but we can't just let natural resources be overrun, and we can't let tourists just fill roads. I mean, there's no reason why an additional 2,000 tourists a day should come to Oahu, rent rental cars, and basically slow down traffic so much that the rest of us can't get around the island. Okay, it's really important that we figure out ways to ration scarce resources. The old days, we felt we didn't have to do that. There are less tourists, smaller population. We just saw less rationing. But then again, you can go back to the 1980s, and when I first came to Hawaii, I was shocked at the overcrowding at Hanauma Bay. The first time I went to Hanauma Bay, most of the beach was just cigarette butts from people who had been smoking at the beach and put their cigarette out on the beach. And, it was in the 1980s they decided no more smoking at Hanauma Bay. Okay, I just want to note some of these congestion problems go back a long way. Hanauma Bay is a case study in us trying to solve that congestion problem, and it's gone on for a long period of time. And I'm still not quite sure we're at the optimal place, but we're certainly doing much better. We don't like to think that we need to manage all the rest of our resources that way. It takes away from, it kind of takes away from the beauty and the, in some sense, the spontaneity of the place where we live, to have everything so managed. And that I think there's a certain feeling by many people in Hawaii that we're losing something by doing that managing. We are, but we have to do it if we're going to be doing it. Is tourism ever going to be a really small industry here? No, of course not. People love to come to Hawaii. That's not going to change. It's only going to change if we end up polluting it or ruining it. People are always going to want to come here. Do we need to have it so that tourism is approximately a quarter of our income every year, of our output? And no, that could be. I mean, if we work to stimulate other industries, the tourism will become a smaller part of that. Do we need to have 10.4 million tourists a year here? Not necessarily. These are all questions that we need to be addressing. We've just been slow in doing that. The point isn't how slow we are. It's the fact is there a process that's going on where people can bring their opinions to bear and realize that their opinion may not end up being what we do, but we really need to be consulting with everybody and figuring out, are there some solutions there where there's a broad public consensus? I think in all sorts of areas there are. There's other solutions economists propose, like roadway pricing. And every time I bring it up, I see people in the audience just roll their eyes.
Yeah.
Same people though afterwards wound up complaining about how difficult it was once school opened to drive in from Aiea to bring their son or daughter to Punahou Day. Personalize it there. Okay.
So I think, as an economist, and based on what you've said already, I think I already know your answer. I just want to hear it out of your mouth. So where do you stand on slapping a price tag on, like, oh, you're a tourist and you want to go hike XYZ trail? Congratulations, make a reservation and here's a price tag. Or do you think just
absolutely, we absolutely have to do that at crowded places? And I mean, if we don't, we're just asking for it too. I mean, things like the Pillbox Trail out in Lanikai, which is a wonderful trail. I mean, the last time that I did that at night, there were tens of thousands of people who'd arrived in Lanikai. Yeah, I mean, that's been 3 or 4 years now since I did that, but there were several thousand. I won't say tens of thousands. There's several thousand people who'd arrived. It was wall to wall people, both going up and down the trail. It first of all took away from the experience, but our trails won't handle that. We absolutely need to be doing something to ration. Whether we charge a price or not, I mean, we need to have a fixed number of slots. We need to be putting more resources into DLNR too, to be able to monitor these trails and to make sure that people aren't just climbing over fences. I mean, I don't have much sympathy, say, for people who want to climb the haiku stairs, who do it by crossing private property, by trespassing, by making the neighborhood where the thing starts a living hell. Also seems to me that the city and the state should have moved faster to cooperate and figure out a solution there, whether it's closing it down or whether it's coming up with ways to get people to a place where they can start that hike, climb, and not totally bother people in the neighborhood. To me, this is all something that was very feasible. We actually remodeled those steps a ways back now, I think almost a decade ago. We've just let them sit there as we haven't been able to solve the other problems. The other problems require cooperation between the state and the city. That's been very difficult in general in Hawaii, partly because the mayor and governor are often in political competition with each other. And partly because we haven't really figured out ways to make that type of cooperation more plausible and more feasible. Whenever the state and the city have to cooperate, I think we end up with all sorts of problematic areas. Homelessness is one of those things too, where the city does a crackdown and all of a sudden almost figure out where the state property is where the city can't go, or vice versa. And in recent years, the city and the state have started cooperating, but the cooperation's been really limited. And it's a type of stuff that, it's a small islands, there's a limited number of governments. We should see better cooperation across the governments. We need to figure out ways to bring that about. If I sound like an optimist, I am kind of an optimist, but about Hawaii.
I mean, that's good. That's good. I mean,
having taught at UH for so many years, here's what I see. I see smart kids, eager to learn, who, when they get out and they get a good education, they do tremendous things with those educations. You know, all the tools are here, and one of the things we need to do is to figure out how to make sure that there are better opportunities for people. We need to be looking, and we don't like to think this way in the islands, but we need to be looking at ways in which people who have great businesses and great business ideas say, I'd like to locate them in the islands. And for that, we need to be asking, okay, how are we treating these new businesses? I think that's a general problem with us. We're really not looking at what is it that we're doing to foster the growth of new business. You know, and if you make the life of a new business a living hell, people won't come here. And it is a matter not just of people who live here starting businesses, but of outsiders bringing the business in. Because when the outsiders bring the business in, that's a sign of a vibrant business climate. When no outsiders come, that's a sign that you've made doing business way too difficult. Essentially, that's what we need to diversify the economy. We need to be we need to be ensuring that people can start up businesses in new areas and that they'll prosper. You know, I certainly see areas where we've done not such a bad job with this. The film industry is one. The film tax credit, I think, has worked reasonably well. There are problems when you have tax credits of people in the industry becoming too dependent on the tax credit. We see in the film industry that almost every year they're asking for an increase in the credit. But then again, the legislature's been, I think, reasonably responsible in trying to make sure that there are some inducements for outside filmmakers to come here and to bring large productions here. We're at a point in Hawaii, we have a tremendous number of large new productions. We have, I tried to emphasize in my work on the film industry that what's needed too is that we put appropriate infrastructure in place. What are we doing to encourage the building of a film studio? And it shouldn't just be that the state's tossing money at it. What are we doing to make this a good place to operate a film studio? But on the education side, we put in place new educational institutions, both at UH Manoa with the Creative Academy and out at University of Hawaii West Oahu with the incredible new facilities out there. You know, this is an industry where I think we've done a pretty good job in figuring out where additional investments need to be made. And it is an industry where there needs to be some small subsidies from the state in order for these other producers to come, because you have to be competitive with other areas. You just need to be careful. You can't run a whole industry on subsidies. You know, if you run a whole industry on subsidies, what you'll find is that at some point it may not be worth having the industry here. So that's always a precarious existence. But I see numerous areas here where we can do better. And one area is just in research in general. People do forget just how much research is done up at the University of Hawaii, making it easier for the University of Hawaii to engage in research. That's something that ought to be done. Instead, the legislature in recent years has used the University of Hawaii as kind of a whipping boy. It's popular. It's become popular to attack egghead intellectuals. People who are out there sitting in labs who are out of touch with what's going on, and yet that's bringing in once we include the multiplier effects, close to $1 billion a year. This is only $100 billion economy. We need to be looking at some of these other areas and asking how can we attract new research, not just the University of Hawaii, but also to private industry. If you don't have research going on, it's hard to attract really good people in many industries. If you have some research going on, that's enough right away to start bringing good people out here. So we need a combination of things. Who are those good people we're bringing? Some of it's return home of people who've left the islands and want to come back home. You know, the real question too is these people who've left the islands have been successful in Silicon Valley. What would induce them to bring their businesses back to Hawaii? And again, we do need to remember that we are islands in the middle of the Pacific that are somewhat isolated. We're not near centers of business. We're a small market. And it's going to stay that way. We don't want 5, 6, 7 million people here. At least I haven't found anybody who wants 5, 6, 7 million people here. No, we want populations not that much more than what we have today. Okay? We may want some population growth, but not huge amounts of population growth. So why is it you'd ever want to come here? That's something that we need better discussions about. And I think there are good reasons to come here. With new industries, I often tell people, you know, the new industries, people will come here if there's a reason to be here. Nobody just comes to Hawaii. I mean, if you're in Silicon Valley, you have huge talent pools. You can go to lunch and be talking with other people in your field about all sorts of new ideas that are coming up in other places. You have access to parts being shipped in really easily, whether it's via rail, air, or truck. Here, we're left with an antiquated shipping, an antiquated shipping industry, expensive air transportation. People have to ask, why is it that industries want to be here? And I think there are certain types of industries where there's real good reasons to be here. The film industry is one. You don't see many films being filmed here that don't use Hawaii's natural beauty, or the diverse ethnic populations that we have in Hawaii that provides the diverse talents that are needed in so many modern productions. So we have to ask in these industries, what is it that's going to bring them here? And are those inquiries possible? I mean, can we do this and move forward? Of course. We've done it before, and I think we'll do it again.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely, thank you for meeting. I know you're really tight on time, so